The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Titans of Nuclear. My name is Maddie Hughes-Magruder and I'm here today with Todd Abrajano. Welcome to the show, Todd.
Thanks, Maggie. It's great to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
Of course, of course. So to get started, just tell me a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? Let's go back to the origin story.
Okay. Well, I'm a Midwest guy, born and raised. I was born in Waterloo, Iowa. Lived there for maybe a couple of months before my parents decided to relocate. Ultimately, I ended up growing up in Kansas City area on the Kansas side of the state line there. But spent my formative years there in Kansas City, and then throughout my life, I've sort of lived in a number of different places throughout the U.S. and went to college on the East Coast, went back to Kansas City area for some work, and then proceeded to make my way across the state of Missouri slowly but surely. Ended up working in the Missouri State Legislature for a couple of years for the Speaker of the House there, and then ultimately got a job offer in St. Louis, Missouri with a large public affairs and PR company. And so ended up living in St. Louis for about 15 years before I got an opportunity to come to Washington, D.C. and work in the federal government. And so did that in the beginning of 2017 and spent 4 years in the previous administration. And now I'm back in sort of the private sector, but still living in Northern Virginia.
Perfect. And then through the course of all of that, what was like your focus area? And then when did you encounter nuclear for the first time?
Yeah, so I am not an engineer or a technical person by trade, and I certainly wasn't involved in nuclear for a lot of my career. But I did start doing energy projects about 15, 16 years ago when I was working for a company called Fleischmann Hillard in St. Louis, and we did a lot of work for their clients in public affairs and government affairs, and so. The first couple of projects that really got me interested in energy were working on the Rockies Express pipeline, which was piping natural gas across the country from Colorado all the way to Pennsylvania, and then worked with St. Louis is a coal heavy state. There are a lot of major coal companies that are located there or were located there, and so had an opportunity to work on a project which was one of the very first sort of cleaner coal power plants in the world, and it was called Prairie State Energy Campus, which was located just outside of St. Louis in southern Illinois. And so those two projects really got me interested in the energy space, and I continued to work on energy off and on throughout the rest of my career. But it wasn't really until I went to work for the federal government that I got heavily involved in energy and then ultimately involved in nuclear. When I went into the administration, I served the Department of Commerce for a year before transferring over to a little-known agency called the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. And they're a really unique agency in the fact that they sort of have a dual mandate. They are directed by Congress to help U.S. companies grow jobs and grow exports, but we're also passed by the Congress to help low and middle income countries create large-scale infrastructure projects in their countries. And so a lot of the portfolio at the U.S. Trade and Development Agency that I worked on while I was there focused on energy. It was about half of the portfolio size. And so we did energy projects just about in everything you could imagine. Renewables, so solar, wind, battery storage, a lot of LNG projects while I was there. Coal, I think, was sort of on a downward trend at that point, so we didn't do any coal projects, but the agency had not done a project in the nuclear space when I was there in probably about 13 years, I think it was. And I had a chance to go to Brussels in October of 2019. And at the time, Secretary of Energy Perry was leading a delegation of U.S. government officials and private sector CEOs to have what became the first U.S. EU high-level SMR discussion in Belgium. And so I was over there for that, representing the agency that I was working at the time, and really got to hear all about sort of what was going on in the advanced nuclear space and learn about SMRs. At the time I had really no experience or education in the industry. But what I learned while I was in Brussels for the couple of days that I was there really got me excited about the industry and the space. And I came back to USTDA and I talked to the staff and I said, we really need to get involved in doing some nuclear projects. And so the staff went to work to try to find some opportunities to be able to put some projects together in the nuclear space. And I think by the time I ended up leaving the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, I had signed, I think, almost a half a dozen projects all throughout sort of the advanced nuclear space. And so it was a great experience over sort of about a year and a half that I had in sort of getting an initial education and introduction into the industry. And when I came back out into the private sector, I went back to a company that I had founded back in 2010 and started doing some work for some energy clients. Initially in the renewable space, I was working with a solar company based out of Australia. But then the opportunity came along and USNIC was looking for a new president and CEO. And I thought that would be a great opportunity for me to get back into the nuclear space and pretty much do what I did when I served in the federal government, which was, export promotion of great and what I believe to be the best, technologies in the world, especially in this particular industry. And so threw my hat in the ring to become the president and CEO of USNIC. And here we are today. And I tell you what, I've been in the job for about 15 months now. And it really is incredibly similar to the job that I used to do when I was the head of the U.S. Trade Development Agency. It's working with different technology providers every day. We've got some really great member companies that are doing some incredible things. And to be able to take those technologies and help promote them, not only here in the US, but overseas is a great job and one that I wake up with a smile on my face to do every single day.
That's so exciting. Yeah. Not a lot of people have that opportunity to be that excited about their job, but it's so great that you attended that conference, learned a lot more, and it seems to have really taken your career on a whole new trajectory. But yeah, since 2019, how have you seen the nuclear space and specifically SMRs change either in policy or the attention that it's gotten? I've seen a fair amount since joining the industry in 2021, but I can only imagine what those years have looked like. So yeah, paint that picture for me.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And I think, when I first started learning about advanced nuclear and SMRs, it was really sort of at a real tipping point in terms of getting ready to take off. We had those initial discussions. I think there were probably about 7 or 8 different CEOs who were all members of USNIC at the time. And I didn't really know much about USNIC either at the time, but had a great opportunity to meet them. But a lot of that conversation back in 2019 was, how do we get policymakers to start really paying attention to the industry? How do we get regulators to start agreeing on how we can get these types of new technologies licensed and actually out and deployed? And I feel like that was really the beginning of that conversation. And since that time, over the last 5 years or so, we've seen a lot of movement in the space. The U.S. Congress, for example, has set forth billions and billions and tens of billions of dollars actually for advanced nuclear and for demonstration projects to start building the very first advanced reactors and national labs across the country. I think we're on pace now to start seeing actual commercial deployment towards the end of this decade, and certainly into the 2030s. We're going to see an incredible exponential explosion in terms of how many of these units are commercialized and how many are actually deployed. And so between government financing, commercial interest, just the other day, I think it was about a week ago, actually, you had 3 of the biggest energy users in the United States between Google and Microsoft and Nucor Steel all band together to put forth an RFI looking for new ways to bring clean energy into their particular spaces and industries. And there's just a lot of different things that have been happening between both the government side and the commercial side, and it's all been very, very positive. So the upward trend has certainly taken off in the last 5 years, more so than I even thought possible. And I think it's going to continue that upward trend for quite a while.
That's great. Yeah, I love talking about the positives, but yeah, let's talk about some of the challenges to actually getting there. If you had
Sure.
the ear of a policymaker, let's say, maybe Speaker of the House or whatever happens in November, what is like the one thing that you would say to really like emphasize the main points of the U.S. nuclear industry to really accelerate this, that a policymaker could achieve?
Yeah. So I think one, as I said, I think the current Congress and previous Congresses have already done an amazing job in sort of helping this industry along the way. If there was one thing that I would continue to push for with the Speaker of the House, if I was sitting down to have a conversation with him, is continued funding to guarantee HALEU production is finally up and running in the United States. For as much as, we like to think about the upside of this industry and for all of the different interests that we've been getting, not only here in the US, but across the world in terms of, bringing on SMRs and microreactors onto the grid. None of that is ever going to happen if we don't have the fuel to support those power plants. And so we have to be able to get HALEU production up and running domestically here in the United States so that we have a safe, secure fuel supply for these reactors moving forward. And so, there have been some small amounts of money over the last several years that have been put into developing a HALEU program here in the United States through government funding, but that money has not been completely guaranteed, and I think it's incredibly important because it's such an opportunity. And look, the nuclear space. It provides energy security for us in the U.S., but it also provides a lot of other things in terms of geopolitics and strategy and sort of who our friends and partners are overseas. And if we can start working with a number of countries across the world to develop U.S. technology-based reactors in their countries and provide the fuel to them as well, we're going to be in a much better position strategically and from a security perspective, both here and abroad, for a long, long time. And so got to have the fuel. It's incredibly important. And I think that's the one thing that I would say if I had the opportunity to have a chat with the speaker right now.
No, that's great. And most of our listeners are usually nuclear wonks, but could you explain in just a couple of sentences, like what is HALEU and why is it important?
Sure. So HALEU is high assay, low enriched uranium. Typically, the uranium that is enriched for what we consider sort of our current operating fleet of large-scale gigawatt reactors that we have across the country, that's enriched up to about 5%. HALEU, which is going to be used in a majority of the advanced reactor technologies that are under development today, is typically enriched just under 20%, about 19.75%. So it's a completely different fuel. It's a completely different type of enriched fuel, and the platforms or the production of these fuels. Typically, when you think of nuclear fuel, you think about the big long rods that go into the reactor cores of these large scale facilities. But a lot of the newer technologies are utilizing different platforms for the fuel. So you may have some typical rods for some of these different reactors, but you also may have basically, you can have HALEU fuel that looks like a billiard ball. It's about the same size, and they'll put hundreds of thousands of them inside of a reactor, and they can last for quite a while. And the fact that they're enriched, almost 4 times as much as typical nuclear fuel has been, just allows the fuel to last a lot longer in those types of reactors. I mean, you can some of the reactors will last up to 7.5, 8 years with the fuel that's being cycled through, and so much more efficient, in my opinion, much more effective, in my opinion. But as I said before, it's all theory until we can actually get the fuel produced, and so that's why it's so important.
No, totally. And does USNIC, are any of your members fusion companies? Do you guys also do that, or are you mostly focused on fission?
So we're mostly focused on fission. We do keep an eye on what's going on with fusion, but almost all of our members are focused on fusion. There are some of our members are working on some fusion projects, like General Atomics, for example. But for the most part, all of our members are working on fusion.
Okay.
Or are in the supply chain for for those types of companies.
And then similarly, my understanding is that most members are US based, but what kind of like international collaborations or even international companies are members? And then, what partnerships is USNIC trying to foster internationally?
Yeah, so we do have mostly U.S. membership, but we do have a number of companies that are foreign owned but have U.S. based subsidiaries. So, Abrajano, for example, GE Hitachi obviously is a joint venture between Hitachi and General Electric. We have a number of companies like that, but for the most part, they are U.S. based, U.S. companies. But in terms of the types of things that we look to do internationally, I think my interest in the international space is twofold. One, I have a degree in international relations, so it's always been an interest for me to do some international work. But then when I was in the previous administration, being able to do as much international work and being at an agency, actually both places I was at, Commerce and the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, both had a significant focus internationally. I did a lot of work with the International Trade Administration and Commerce when I was there. And so basically the full 4 years that I spent in the previous administration, I spent looking at international export opportunities. And so I had the opportunity to kind of go all over the world, and to be in some places where electricity generation is sort of not taken for granted like it is here in the United States. And so for me, the opportunity to go to some of these international locations and talk to the people who are either in government or in the private sector and are interested in bringing nuclear to their countries, it's something that's really important to me and something that I really enjoy doing. And so a lot of what USNIC is going to be focused on, at least under my leadership while I'm here, is how do we help our member companies and organizations get into the international space, get their technology into international markets. It's going to be a big, big push for us.
That's great. So if we could imagine, if you have a new member coming to you, they have a technology that's ready to go, fully fledged design, and they're exclusively focused internationally, where would you point them directionally in the world where you would put your money that there would be an early deployment for an SMR technology? And let's just assume that it doesn't use advanced fuel types, so there's an existing supply chain readily deployable. Where would you point that company towards?
Sure. Well, I think we've already seen sort of the markets developing internationally for the last several years. When I was serving at USTDA, most of the projects that I signed off on while I was there were in the Eastern European part of the world. But a lot of the opportunities are still there right now, but outside of sort of Central and Eastern Europe, we're starting to see opportunities pop up in Southeast Asia. The Philippines are very interested. Indonesia is very interested. There are several countries in Africa that are working their way through the process of sort of becoming nuclear ready. Kenya, for example, is very interested. Ghana, where I was at last year and spoke at the very first nuclear energy summit in Africa. So there are a number of countries sort of all across the world that are, I think, just chomping at the bit to figure out how they can get nuclear reactors into their country if they haven't done so already. But those are a couple of the places I think that we're gonna see some focus over the next several years.
Great. And in each of those markets, I guess, who is really eating our lunch when it comes to U.S. nuclear industry? Like, who should we be most concerned about? And then how could we navigate around and create a market where people are really interested in U.S. nuclear technology versus others?
Yeah. So, in terms of getting our lunch eaten from a U.S. perspective, that's been happening for quite a while. One of the more interesting things that I had an opportunity to see as I traveled the globe and the government, as I went to a lot of countries in Africa and a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, you would see either China in their Belt and Road Initiative heavily investing in those countries. So, and it's no different in the nuclear space. But also Russia. Russia has been for a long time sort of a supplier for Eastern and Central Europe, and what's happened in Ukraine over the last year or so has been, I think, certainly helping to change minds of folks in those countries across Europe in terms of who that they want their partners to be, who they want their providers to be. And so I think at least in across the European continent, we're starting to see a shift away from Russia. But China is now coming on. They've built the very first SMR. It's currently operational. They're certainly going to look, I think, to export that product to as many countries as they can. And certainly Russia and places like Africa and Southeast Asia are still continuing to be competitive. And until the U.S., and I think this is one of the other big things that I'm focused on as the head of USNIC, but we have to do better from a U.S. perspective, not just individual companies, but we have to do better as a country to be able to compete with China and Russia across the globe. One of the things that I was lucky to be a part of when I was working in the government was a collaboration between the State Department and the Department of Commerce called Team USA. It wasn't specifically focused on the nuclear industry, but it was focused on how do we help U.S. companies and U.S. technologies compete against China and Russia all over the globe. And I think that that's something that should continue. I think there's currently a Team USA for the energy space through DOE that looks at things like that. But one of the things that I've been saying for a very long time is that we need to have someone in the White House serving as a special assistant to the president level or higher, whose sole job is to coordinate with U.S. departments and agencies throughout government and the nuclear industry to figure out how we can do sort of what the semiconductor industry is doing right now. I mean, the U.S. government came together, figured out that semiconductors were very important technology that we needed to not cede to China. We need to do the same thing with nuclear with respect to Russia and China and figure out how we can work much more closely together to be able to provide competitive bids when countries are looking to build either large-scale nuclear facilities or SMRs or microreactors.
No, I 100% agree. Especially, the ability for a Russia or a China to not only be able to point to an existing SMR facility and say, look, it works. And we're doing a lot of that with the advanced reactor demonstration projects that are going on in the US, but also, the financing. The financing is really tough. Can you talk a bit about how USNIC thinks about financing for these projects, especially SMRs, and kind of balancing the need for speed, which doesn't happen often with publicly funded projects, but also the need to get these projects deployed. I don't know if you have any thoughts on financing.
Well, I do. I actually have a lot of thoughts on that because
Okay,
a lot of what the U.S. Trade and Development Agency did was provide early stage grant funding for these large scale projects and sort of serve as the tip of the spear to get these projects to the point where they were bankable and then could go to places like, private banks or the Ex-Im Bank here in the U.S. To try to get funding for actually deploying those projects. And so, as I was talking about before, with China and Russia, you've got basically, state entities or state-run entities going out, putting bids in for nuclear power plants all across the world and bringing the financing to the table because it's coming through the state. We don't have that ability to do that in the United States. And so, having agencies like the U.S. Trade Development Agency be able to sort of help get that ball rolling is good. But we need agencies like the Development Finance Corporation to be able to start putting money into these types of projects. Ex-Im, to their credit, has just recently come out saying that they've got a brand new sort of slate of products specifically for the nuclear industry and are ready to start putting billions behind those types of projects, which is very good news. But what I will say, I think in terms of outside of U.S. government funding, we need multilateral development banks like the World Bank and others to start doing nuclear projects. Right now, they're not doing them at all because I think some of the member countries that are associated with those institutions are against nuclear as a whole. But I would venture to say that the vast majority of the countries that are member states of those institutions are pro-nuclear and realize that in order to be able to, hit the goals that have been put forth by a number of different countries in terms of becoming net zero by 2050, we've got to get nuclear into the mix. And so the longer those types of multilateral development banks continue to hold out, providing funding for these types of projects, the harder and harder it's going to be to actually hit those targets by 2050. And so I was pleasantly surprised to hear that the new president of the European Investment Bank came out and said, we're going to start looking at doing nuclear projects. That was very good news. Unfortunately, when I was in Brussels last week at the IAEA Nuclear Energy Summit, there were representatives on the last panel of the day from the EIB and from the EBRD and from CAF, which is sort of the Latin American and Caribbean Investment Bank. And all three of those representatives hedged when it came time, and the question was posed to them about, are you prepared to start funding nuclear projects? And all of them hedged. And so it wasn't the positive answer that I was hoping to hear. And so because of that fact, I think we have to look at a couple of other different options in terms of financing. One, I think we need to either figure out how we can start putting private financing together, or two, we need to figure out how we can put together an actual sort of infrastructure investment bank for nuclear. And there's been talk for a couple of years now about doing just that. But I also think that we've got to get creative, and we've got to start thinking of how we can come up with some different models for private financing. And I think one of the things I talked about earlier with Google and Microsoft and Nucor coming together to try to figure out how they can start funding some of these new technologies that may not have been commercialized yet. I think it's going to take something like that, where you've got some very big spenders outside of government who are willing to put their money on the line and de-risk some of these first-of-a-kind reactor projects as they're starting to come online. And I think once that happens, we'll start to see order books increase for a number of companies that are invested in this space, and we'll start to see real sort of commercialization take place. But financing is a huge issue. If you asked me earlier, what are the two things I would talk about if I had a chance to talk to the Speaker of the House, it would have been HALO and financing. So it's one of the things that I think about almost on a daily basis in terms of how do we get to a better place than we are now.
That is so true. Yeah, it is insane how expensive some of these projects can get. But are there any cost saving advantages for SMRs, or does it come down to, I guess, backing up like one step back from that question, what's typically the driver for cost in a nuclear project? Is it, let's say, the fuel, or the capital costs, or the cost of capital?
So I think, in terms of lifetime cost for a nuclear power plant, fuel is probably the one thing that can at least be fixed at some point down the road. I mean, ultimately, we're going to get to a point where we're going to know how much fuel is going to cost, and that'll be built in. What we don't know right now is sort of the initial capital outlay. So we haven't built any SMRs yet. And when we build the first one, it's going to be the first of a kind. And we're never going to be able to really realize the full cost savings until we can start building these units in multiples or multiples of multiples. We really need to build fleets instead of one-offs, because it's not until we do that we're going to see the sort of economies of scale come together to build these types of things. And that goes not just for the developers at the reactor level, but that goes for the entire supply chain as well, because we've got hundreds of different companies that are making things to build these reactors. And all of them sort of need to have some stability and consistency in terms of what they know their order books are going to look like down the road. And so it really is going to come down to, how many customers are going to be ready to commit and actually ink a contract for, 5 or 10 or 20. So companies like Google and Microsoft are building data centers all the time. I live in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is the data center capital of the world. And every time I drive around town, I see a new data center going up almost on a weekly basis. And so, each one of those could potentially be run by, a micro reactor, or you could have a group of them run by a small modular reactor. And so, when companies like a Google or a Microsoft or an Amazon or a Nucor really start to say, okay, we would like to we'd like to order 20 of your units, at that point, we'll really start to see the cost savings come down. And when that cost savings does come, or when that cost does come down, I think you're going to see that nuclear is incredibly competitive with some of the other energy generation technologies that are out there right now.
Totally agreed. And I think one of the major hesitations that are out there is usually, at least for investors, would actually be the timeline risks associated with licensing. So I guess if you can speak to US regulations or any international regulations that you've seen that maybe do it better. Are the way our regulations currently structured actually promoting a fleet-wide approach, or is it still of the old model of you build one of these, it runs for 50 years and it's a massive plant, so you don't really need to build a ton?
Yeah, well, I think, most of the regulators that I've talked to across the globe recognize that, SMRs and MMRs are sort of a different breed because they will be ordered in a much larger number than typical gigawatt scale nuclear reactors have been in the past. And so I think all of those regulators understand the necessity to try to figure out a way to become much more efficient in terms of their licensing process for these new advanced reactors. And so here in the United States, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has been working, at least for a couple of years, on what's considered to be Part 53 of their regulatory structure, which is specifically geared towards new advanced reactors. We've hit a few bumps in the road along the way with that process, but just recently, the NRC came out with some recommendations back to the staff of the NRC to revise and revamp sort of how they've initially thought out what Part 53 looks like and how to best implement that for the developers that are going to be utilizing that part of the regulatory structure. So I'm hopeful that by the end of the year, we're going to have something that looks a lot better than we were looking at maybe a year or two ago with respect to how different reactor developers can go through the NRC licensing process. That being said, each country is different. There's a lot of talk about harmonization and standardization of regulatory structures across the world. The USNRC has been working very closely with the Canadian regulators and now most recently with the UK regulators to try to figure out how much of that process can potentially be harmonized or standardized. But I don't think it's ever going to be 100% exactly the same from country to country because each country's got its own, sort of unique set of rules and things that they need to think about. But to be able to get to a point where we could have, a large portion of the regulatory systems harmonized and standardized across the globe, I think that would be great. And so I think that work continues, and I was pleased that the USNRC has been working on that for the last several years. In terms of, timelines for making it through the process, typically licensing has been, potentially a 5-year process from start to finish. And I think that, in order to be able to churn out as many, small modular reactors and micro reactors as I think that we're going to have demand for, that's going to have to be much, much quicker. And I would like to see it come down to potentially anywhere from a 12 to 24-month process as opposed to a, 60-month process to get through the entire system. And I think that's completely doable. But we just have to have the right underlying regulatory structure to be able to get there. The other thing that I'll say on this is, I think that we have a real opportunity in front of us with the onset of AI to be able to figure out how to completely go through the NRC regulatory process in a much quicker and much more efficient way. Because if you can use AI to do that, you've got a real ability to figure out just from the data that the NRC currently has in its system, what it is that they're looking for, and get all your filings and all your white papers and all of those things done in a much more timely fashion than I think humans have been able to do it on their own. And so between the efficiencies that the NRC is working on and between AI, I think we can get to a process that's much more quick as the years go by.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I didn't even realize that our conversation would go there, but yeah, AI seems to have huge potential upside. But then you are kind of combining, at least from a public perspective, public perception, something nuclear. It's like, oh man, do we really want a computer making those decisions for us? Do you anticipate any issues like that? I see huge benefits for AI, but it seems like it would place another hurdle on public perception and communication.
I think that's an interesting point. I'll say this. I think the nuclear industry over the last decade has done a really good job of turning public perception around and getting it to start trending back up in the right direction again. AI is so nascent. Most people really don't understand what it is or what it does. And to be honest with you, the people that work on it every day are trying to figure out what AI is going to look like 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 2 years from now. All that being said, I think you're right. I think we have an incredible opportunity with AI, not just in the nuclear space, but in a number of different spaces. And I think that, if we utilize AI the right way, and we as an industry and sort of AI as its own industry does its job in terms of effectively communicating with both policymakers and the public, those are things that I certainly think could be overcome.
Agreed. No, I think that's great. Do you know of or want to share any like major milestones or achievements by the nuclear industry in recent years? Any like major wins we should be celebrating more often?
Well, I think this question is really kind of goes back to what I said earlier about the things that Congress has done. As an industry overall, we have done a really good job of convincing government policymakers that this is an industry that they should invest in, and that has been probably the biggest news over the last 5 years. Between the billions of dollars that have been invested from the federal government to the policies that they have created to allow the industry to flourish outside of the funding, we are in a space right now as a nuclear industry that I don't think the industry has seen for a very, very long time. And so just in terms of, being able to communicate that's really the biggest win as far as I'm concerned, that in the last 5 years, we've seen bipartisan agreement, which is incredibly odd in Washington, D.C. and on Capitol Hill, but we've seen bipartisan agreement, an incredible bipartisan agreement in the nuclear industry. And, I think one of the really important things, there was a bill that just passed Congress a couple of weeks ago with a vote of 365 in favor.
Wow.
That's incredible. I mean, we've got 435 members of Congress. Not all of them voted on that particular bill, but to have that number of representatives and members of Congress vote in favor of a bill on the Hill is almost unheard of today. And so to have that agreement, to have that support is as far as I'm concerned, sort of the biggest win for the industry.
Totally. Yeah. That's a rarity. And one thing that I found to be super exciting about the nuclear industry is there is that momentum there, and either side can really pick out like what benefits it. And there's a lot of like harmonization in that respect. So I think that's one thing that the nuclear industry does a lot better than others. But looking ahead, what are some of the priorities? You talked about, of course, HALEU and financing, but any other like major priorities for USNIC, and then what steps you all are taking to achieve those?
Yeah, well, just in terms of getting the industry off, those are two things that we're certainly focused on. But I think for our organization, the other big one is really going to just be figuring out how we can develop markets for our technology. Initially everybody sort of thinks about electricity generation. And when you think about that, you think about big utility companies. But really for small modular reactors and micro reactors, the potential markets are so much more broad because these types of technologies can do so many more things. I mean, it's not just electricity generation. A lot of industrial companies are looking at using nuclear to decarbonize their efforts on a regular basis. You can use nuclear, advanced nuclear to heat different types of plants. If you look at what X Energy is doing with Dow down in southern Texas on the Gulf Coast, Dow is utilizing potentially that technology to not only electrify one of their petrochemical plants, but also provide the process heat for that plant as well. So you can utilize new nuclear to produce green hydrogen. You can utilize it for water desalination. So, I mean, there are a number of different things in a number of different markets that really set advanced nuclear off from what people typically think of the big, large scale reactors. And so that's kind of what we're going to be focused on outside of how do we get the fuel and how do we get the financing is how do we develop new markets for these technologies and where can we put them? And I think, the one thing I'll say in addition to that, when you do think about those larger sort of gigawatt scale nuclear reactors that are dotting the landscape all across the country, those types of power plants are, for the most part, electrifying, over 1 million homes in certain circumstances. With a microreactor or an SMR, you can literally put these types of technologies anywhere. The space they take up is considerably less than not only typical nuclear power plants, but certainly solar and wind farms. And you can utilize these types of technologies to do so many different things in so many different places. I mean, to the most rural portions of America, you can drop in a microreactor and have electricity or any type of other process heat types of things, district heating, creation for whatever, the things I talked about before that you couldn't do by dropping a gigawatt scale nuclear reactor in that site. And so, like I said, the markets are, I think, incredibly broad, and I'm really looking forward, I think, over the next 10 years to really figuring out where those markets are and how they're going to develop. And I think it's one of the most interesting things about my job, I think, moving forward.
That is so exciting. Are there any final thoughts or messages that you want our listeners to really take away from this conversation?
Well, a couple of things. One, just quick plug for USNIC. We have membership right now at approximately 90 different companies and organizations, but we're growing very quickly. And from our perspective, we are the trade association for the advanced nuclear industry, not just for our reactor developers, but as I said before, the entire supply chain. We've got a number of academic institutions. We've got a couple of national labs who are members. And so, we're very broad. We take care of our members from the smallest to the largest. And so if there's interest, if you're in the nuclear industry and you're not a member of USNIC, I would encourage you to check us out at usnic.org. And secondarily, if this airs in time, we've got our upcoming Advanced Reactor Summit. We do it every year. This will be our 11th iteration in Houston, Texas, from April 15th through the 18th of this year. It's going to be an incredible event. It's 2 days of plenaries. There will be a tour on the Thursday of that week. And we're doing our big Trailblazer Award reception on Tuesday evening of that week. And we just announced yesterday that our award recipients this year are going to be former Secretary of Energy Rick Perry and former CEO of Southern Company Tom Fanning. And so looking forward to getting down to Houston in mid-April next month and enjoying all of the festivities that go along with our annual Advanced Reactor Summit.
Exciting stuff. Oh, yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Todd, for taking the time. I'm sure our listeners will enjoy as well. I really appreciate you being on with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Maddie. Great to see you.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.